Okay. Well, thank you so much for joining us. Today we have Jon Venn, who is the Director of Hiring for the Staunton City Public Schools, and he is going to give us some tips on how you can strengthen your application. So, welcome, Jon.
Thank you, Lindsay.
Yeah. So, first, start off by telling us some of the popular positions that you have and what time of year those are typically posted on your website.
So, we have been, I would say, blessed to have, for the most part, throughout the school year, to be fully staffed with our teaching positions. So, typically, the positions that we have open throughout the school year are more of the paraprofessional positions. So, instructional assistants are those folks who support teachers, clerical staff. We have cafeteria positions, bus drivers, as well as custodial positions. So those are the typical positions we have open during the school year. So in terms of teaching positions, what typically happens, we send out intent forms in January. In fact, we're sending them out tomorrow, I believe, asking folks what is their intention to return next year. And what that then does, it allows us to gauge staffing needs, recruitment needs, and efforts for the following school year. So we'll have a better idea when that intent form goes out within the next week as to which teachers will be leaving us. That in turn then, as I said, will drive our recruitment efforts. And typically our turnover rate for teachers is about 10 to 12%, which is average for this area.
Okay.
Another piece as it relates to anybody at Mary Baldwin who is interested in teaching, we do or have in the past pre-COVID heavily relied on the Shenandoah Valley Regional Job Fair, which is held in Harrisonburg. We will not be attending that this year for COVID reasons,
Sure.
but we'll probably consider other virtual job fairs to do that. I would also say, because of the proximity of Mary Baldwin and the size of Staunton, I would encourage any students at Mary Baldwin to look into our substitute program. We outsourced that program to a company called ESS, and even though we're in a virtual format right now, we anticipate coming back in a hybrid model later this month and are looking for substitutes. And if your class schedule allows it, it's a good way to earn extra money, and especially it's a good way to get your feet wet in terms of the teaching profession and to audition, if you will, for the schools if you have an interest in being a teacher.
Nice. So if a student has an opportunity to substitute or they're fortunate enough to practicum within the Staunton City Schools, what are some ways that they can include that on their resume to show that they already have some experience?
Yeah, so what I would say about resumes, keep it simple.
Okay.
One page. Principals do not have a lot of time to go through a 4-page resume. So that would be the first tip I would have. The second tip would be make sure you proofread the resume before you submit it, whether it's through an application or however you do that. Because if there are grammatical errors, spelling errors, that resume will quickly go to the bottom of the stack, as you can appreciate. So that's important. Another thing I think it's important to do is to list any of your part-time jobs you may have or any volunteer efforts, because most college students will not have had the ability to have full-time jobs at that point. So it's important that you list what part-time jobs or any volunteer efforts that you've had up until this point as a student. And I would also say if you have any experience working with children, that clearly is a plus for us. We're in the business of educating children. So if you have experience, whatever that may be, whether you're at working at church, whatever that may be, please include that on your resume.
So it can be as informal as working in a nursery at a church or even just babysitting for a family, but some kind of experience.
Yeah, it's that principals, when we start looking at whether it's a full-time position or even a substitute position, having prior experience, whatever that may look like, working with children, is a plus.
Great. And keep it to one page and definitely
Yeah,
double
keep it
check that
simple.
grammar.
Please make sure you proofread for spelling and grammatical errors.
Great. And then what kind of campus involvement makes an application look more attractive too? So maybe a student is in a club or leading a club, playing a sport. Should they include that information?
I would include any of those on your resume. I think that also shows that you're more well-rounded. You're getting out there. You're participating in a variety of activities, so you're not just a student. And as I said, volunteer efforts or club activities are a great way to show that.
Awesome. So there's some great resume tips. And then moving on to a cover letter, which a lot of recent graduates haven't written a bunch of these. So is that part of the Staunton City application? And what are some tips for creating a good cover letter?
It's not a requirement, but I strongly encourage folks to include a cover letter. And like a resume, keep it simple, keep it concise, keep it to one page. And again, avoid spelling and grammatical errors. The resume, typically you'll list prior work experiences or volunteer experiences, but in a cover letter, I would also include any special skills you may have. For example, if you're bilingual, you use sign language, things like that may be relevant for the position that you're applying for. Another tip or a strong suggestion is this, and I see it unfortunately way too often, particularly when students are graduating from a teacher prep program and they are submitting applications to a number of school divisions. What will happen is in that cover letter, they basically, what I'm saying is avoid cut and paste errors. So what we see is somebody may apply to Augusta County Public Schools and Staunton City Schools in Waynesboro and Harrisonburg, and they leave in, let's say, Augusta County. And so they send that cover letter to Staunton City Schools with, I would love to work in Augusta County Public Schools. Well, again, what that shows is they're not taking the time to really attention to detail and proofread. So that's something that I would encourage folks to make sure that you don't have any cut paste errors when you are sending out cover letters.
Yeah, so those details definitely matter.
Clearly they do.
Yeah. All right, so let's say someone presents a strong resume, they have a great cover letter, and they get to the interview process. What are some things they can do to help prepare for that?
Well, let me just, before I get to that,
Sure.
let me just kind of step back and say, we use an applicant tracking system on our employment website called Talent Ed Recruit and Hire. And there is in the upper right-hand corner, when you go to our employment website, there is a button on there that says job alerts. And I would encourage folks to go ahead and sign up in advance for that. And what happens is, I think it's every Sunday night, you'll get an email alerting you to what positions we have open. So I would encourage folks to do that, number one. But if you get to a point, once you apply, find out who the principal, the hiring manager is, and I would strongly encourage folks to go ahead and email who that person is to express an interest and even to submit your resume and cover letter. That's in addition to submitting an application, because what happens is, let's say for a paraprofessional position, we may get anywhere from 30 to 40 applicants. And if you take the time, 5 minutes, to find out who that person is you would be interviewing with, to send an email to really show your interest, you're going to stand out to that person, particularly when they have, as I said, 30 or 40 applications to go through. So I would encourage folks to do that when you apply for a position. I would also say that if you're selected for an interview, and again, if we're talking about schools in Staunton, I realize we're a small city, but I would encourage folks to physically do a dry run before the interview date. And what I mean by that is, get in your car or get however you're going to get there. Go there ahead of time, know where you're going, how long it takes you to get there, where you're going to park, so you get to the interview on time. I know that sounds silly, but I think it's important. The other thing it does, it reduces the anxiety of just the interview itself. If you know where you're going, how long it's going to take, you don't have to worry about that. So that's another suggestion I would make. Don't be late for the interview. Clearly, first impressions matter, and if you're late to an interview, that doesn't bode well for the candidate. I would also say dress appropriately for the position that you're interviewing for, and what I mean by that is you're going to dress, and I'll use this as an example, you're going to dress differently if you are going to interview for, let's say, a custodian position or a cafeteria position versus a teaching position. What I would encourage folks to do would, think about business casual in terms of what to wear. Please no sweatpants, t-shirts, or other type of dress wear that would immediately eliminate you from position. Again, first impressions matter. So I would encourage folks to do that. I would also encourage folks to do their homework about the position that they have applied for and will interview for. What I mean by that is know the position. If it's not on the website, ask for a job description. The location or the school division where you are interviewing, do your homework about the school and the school itself as well as the school division, because that helps you in an interview process have some prior knowledge to be able to discuss during the interview process. This also will help ensure or help you prepare to answer any questions that you're going to be asked, and it also allows you to ask questions about the position when you're given that opportunity. So I would again encourage folks to do their homework. I would also say that during the interview, as much as possible, your answers to the questions should be as concise as possible. Try not to ramble on in hopes that you may answer the question if you can just keep talking, because I've seen that happen before, and I get that it's a stress-provoking process, but again, if you can keep your answers as concise as possible, that's going to help you as well. Also be mindful, and this is something when somebody calls you for an interview, you can ask them how long is the interview, because what that does is it helps you kind of gauge your time limit in responding to questions, because what you don't want to do is, let's say interviews have 30 minutes set for that, and there are 10 questions, and because you're talking excessively, you've only answered 2 questions in 20 minutes, and now you have to get through 8 questions in the next 10 minutes. So ask how long the interview is, and that way it will help gauge you in terms of your time response. I would also say that don't be afraid in an interview to have the interview questions repeated. Because what I also know is some of the questions that are asked in interviews could be multiple questions within one question, and it's really easy to forget what is being asked. So again, don't be afraid to ask questions or ask that the interview questions be repeated during the interview.
Nice. So we went through a lot, so I just want to make sure that we recap some of these interview tips, especially when applying it with Staunton City Schools. So the first thing is try to get to the top of the pile by making sure that you receive those alerts and know what positions are coming up so that you can send messages to those hiring managers. Do a trial run, so make sure when you show up, you're showing up on time, because being late is not acceptable. And
in the right location, that's important.
Right, so will most positions interview at City Hall or at the respective institution where they're applying?
They'll interview at the respective schools.
Okay, great. So good to know that. When you're showing up, make sure you're dressed appropriately. So khakis or professional slacks at minimum, making sure that there's no cleavage or anything up top, a nice blouse, a polo, just at least business casual, if not business professional, for depending on which opportunity you're applying for.
That is correct.
Awesome. And then make sure you know the job description, and if it's not available on the website, ask for a copy. And you can also find out a lot of information about the school by looking on the website or at the job description to help prepare. And then also make sure that your answers are going to be concise, so no rambling. And we try to promote the STAR method. So you want to talk about the situation, the task, the action, and the result as it relates to the question you're being asked. And it's kind of a stressful situation. So if you need the question repeated, or if you need to take a moment to think about your answer, that's completely acceptable.
Absolutely.
Okay.
I think it's important, realize it's only an interview. It's not the end of the world.
Yeah.
There'll be others. I realize you need to put your best forth, but keep that in perspective when you're going into interviews.
Yeah. It's a conversation, right?
Correct. That's exactly right. It's a conversation. It's a conversation.
Yeah. So go ahead.
Can I also just kind of say, if you are selected for a position, I think it's important that if you are currently working, let's say, a part-time job somewhere else, and that you're going to have to give up that job, out of professional courtesy, I always encourage folks to give at least a minimum 2-week notice. Don't just leave your current employer high and dry, because from our perspective, if I reach out to somebody and they tell me, I need to give a 2-week notice, that to me speaks volumes about their professionalism, that they're not just going to cut loose whoever they're working for, because again, that leaves them, high and dry in terms of trying to find a replacement. So I would encourage folks to make sure you're doing that as well. And, the other piece to that is you don't want to burn your bridges where you're currently employed, even if it's a part-time job, because at some point you may very well want to return to that job. And if you leave on good terms, that's going to help your cause later on.
Definitely.
The other piece about public schools, which are a little bit different than private sector, has to do with criminal background checks. So by law, regardless of whatever position you would take, you have to go a criminal background check, which includes being fingerprinted, and it matches your information with the FBI database. It also involves a screening with Child Protective Services that matches your information with the Registry for Child Abuse and Neglect. So again, it's important that people know that if they take a job, they are going to have a criminal background check. And so if there's anything, a tip here would be that if there's anything on your record, and I'm not saying a conviction, but you've been charged with anything, even though you haven't been convicted, when you come in to do the background check, and typically with the schools, I'm the one doing it, be forthright. Let us know in advance that, hey, this is going to pop up. It's better to share with us, at the beginning, that it's sitting out there versus us finding out after the fact. So again, just be mindful of that as well.
Gotcha. So just because you have a speeding ticket or, might have had a little spat with your landlord, those things might not be deal breakers, but it's really important to disclose them.
Oh, absolutely. Well, in speeding tickets, we're only talking about criminal charges. So a speeding ticket, unless you get a reckless driving or something like that, won't show up. But if you have a criminal charge, and I will share this with you, typically what we find in young folks, and this certainly will change, would be a possession of marijuana charge. Happens all the time.
Yeah.
And so that does not rule you out by any means. So please let us know if it's on your record ahead of time, so it's not a surprise when this happens.
Great tips. And especially, entering the workforce, this might be their first full-time job. So you never know, and this would be the first time they've been background checked. So thank you so much. All right, so let's talk about, especially these students that are entering the workforce, a question that's pretty popular. I'm not sure if you guys use it, but typically sometime during the interview process, they're going to be asked, tell me a little bit about yourself. So what are some tips you have for responding to that, or maybe some examples of folks that answer that question really well?
Again, depending on if you're coming out of, you're graduating college, you're coming out into the workforce, I think what you have to your experiences and what you can go back on really are what you've done in college over the 4 years, as well as maybe your junior or senior year in high school. So I do think it's important that you share within reason information about yourself that is relevant to the position that you are applying for. You don't need to go in and say, I went to elementary school at such and such. That's not going to get you too far. But I do think it's important that you try like what you have on your resume or like what you have in your cover letter, talk about those things just in more detail. Because you can't capture everything on a cover letter or a resume, but you certainly can in an interview setting when they give you the opportunity to either ask questions or share a little bit about yourself. You can go into more depth about some of the experiences that you've had that may be relevant to the job.
So maybe one of your passions is, outdoor activities and you're applying to be a PE teacher, then that might be a relevant thing to bring up, right?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. But again, I don't think you need to go back to when you were in middle school or elementary school and have discussions about some things that you've done.
Yeah.
So that I would just keep it relevant to the position that you're applying for.
Great. And I think that was all the questions we had kind of talked about ahead of time, but any other advice or tips you'd like to give our Mary Baldwin students?
We're going to get out of COVID hopefully soon.
Yeah.
It's been, I think, stressful for everybody. The workforce, employment opportunities have been up and down. It's dependent upon, for example, at grocery stores. Lowe's, those type of positions are popping because they need folks. Obviously, in restaurants and places like that, there are fewer opportunities. So from our perspective, we hope, with the vaccines coming sooner than later, that we're going to be back to some sense of normalcy in August of 2021 as we open up a new school year. And, we hope to have a good, understanding about what positions we're going to have available probably by April or May. And I would encourage anybody who listens to this, if you have any questions about employment with Staunton City Schools, for that matter, the City of Staunton, I also work with employment with the City of Staunton. Feel free to reach out to me, and I'd be more than happy to have a conversation with you about that.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Mr. Venn. I'll definitely put some notes from our conversation and include how they can get in touch with you when we post it to our YouTube channel. So
fantastic, Lindsay. Thank you very much for taking the time this morning.
Yes, sir. Well, you